All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. We will be continuing our exploration of postmodern fiction, and particularly the way in which postmodern fiction disrupted and subverted the boundary between what was considered literary fiction, realistic fiction on the one hand, and genre fiction, such as science fiction and fantasy and horror and mystery on the other. And we, for this week, are particularly going to focus on science fiction, partially because I think that's mostly what's in the anthology, but also because I think in a lot of ways science fiction became the preeminent among the genres of genre fiction in the mid-20th century. There was definitely kind of a renaissance of detective fiction and writers like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. And a little later, you have a boom in horror fiction, though there was also an earlier boom in horror fiction around writers like H.P. Lovecraft, and even more disreputable genres like pornography, for instance, get a boost in the mid-20th century with the downfall of literary censorship, and writers who are now considered, important literary figures like William S. Burroughs and Vladimir Nabokov were publishing some of their early work with publishers that mainly dealt in pornography because of its explicit content. So popular genres of all sorts that depart from the sort of strict standard of realism of high literary fiction of the time are getting this sort of bump in the postmodern moment. But I think science fiction in many ways becomes the most interesting to a lot of people because of how much technological development that is happening around this time, because of the technological changes from the development of nuclear weaponry that can destroy the world that we saw Philip K. Dick reflecting on, to the increasing mass media and the developments of things that are starting to look like artificial intelligence. Science fiction as a literature that can reflect on these technological developments in ways that realist fiction can't becomes more prominent. And I think we saw that. We didn't really see much reflection on technology and what it meant in Baldwin, Roth, O'Connor, Cheever. And what we did see generally just seemed to be kind of a blank rejection. There seemed to be a rejection of mass media, for instance, in O'Connor and Baldwin. That while we can, I think, understand why they were doing that, it wasn't really an engagement with it. It was more that just this is bad, almost to the point of movies and comic books are bad for our kids. Is the vibe you get from Sonny's Blues, and A Good Man Is Hard to Find. It's not really so much of an engagement with these technologies, though I'm not necessarily criticizing those stories have other and wonderful merits, but science fiction becomes a genre, an arena in which these things can be looked at with more nuance. And I think you see that in Dick and you see that in Le Guin. So Ursula K. Le Guin, also pictured with her cat because she writes about cats as well. She lived from 1929 to 2018. She was born in Berkeley, California, where her father was an anthropologist. So unlike Dick, who I think came from a more working class background, she came from an upper middle class background because her father was an anthropology professor and an anthropologist, and a rather well-known one. Kroeber was his name. Alfred Kroeber, yeah, it says so right there. And her mother as well, was a folklorist and a writer. So she had professional parents and parents whose interests she would carry on into a different arena. So she, in fact, is sometimes said to be a writer who turns science fiction into anthropology, anthropology being the study of human communities. And we already talked about this swerve in the 60s in the genre of science fiction from the concern with technology that had dominated the field in prior decades to a concern with the social world, almost a turn from the natural sciences to the social sciences. And Le Guin, who has this background in anthropology, which is a social science, is, I think, a key figure here. She's also very unlike Dick, who dropped out of college. She was very highly educated in literature and languages. So she has a degree from Radcliffe and then a master's degree from Columbia in Romance languages and literature. So I think she mainly wrote about French literature. So she is also herself coming from kind of an academic background, and she lived most of her life in Portland, Oregon. And so again, we have this sort of West Coast influence on the literature of the 60s, 70s. That's a departure from the more East Coast oriented publishing scene that had dominated before. So she begins writing science fiction and fantasy in the 60s and becomes known inside and outside the science fiction and fantasy community. But she also did write realistic fiction. She wrote poetry. She wrote children's books. She wrote nonfiction of all sorts, political reflections, literary criticism. So she was also, like Dick, very prolific and productive writer, though I don't think pharmacologically enhanced as in his case. And she was celebrated in her lifetime. She lived to see herself celebrated as one of the major American writers of her time, and she also has entered the Library of America series of those hardcover editions of classic American literature that we mentioned in the Dick discussion as kind of a standard for what the American canon of literature is, the books you should read. And she was also, she harks back to Grace Paley in being someone who is renowned as well for her political stances. And her political stances are rather similar to Grace Paley's. I think both were feminists. I think both in some ways defined themselves as anarchists, which is to say, I think they both defined themselves due to their generation of turning away from the old. Again, we talked about the new left and the old left. So the old left was Marxist, it was communist, it put a lot of faith in there being a scientifically established path to achieve an equal society that would generally be done through distinct entities like labor unions and political parties, and whose result would be the capturing of the state to command the economy and other aspects of society. That was the old left. And I think in the 60s, that was seen by a lot of people who wanted to be on the left, like Le Guin and like Paley, and I think like Pynchon. Dick's politics are more complicated, and I deliberately didn't talk about them in the last lecture. By the end of his life, he called himself a fascist. I think in a lot of ways he was an anarchist too, and Pynchon was an anarchist. So we have four really writers who have some connection to this idea of anarchism, which is that the ultimate aspiration of the radical is that there shouldn't be a state. And I think what this generation of writers, and all these writers, Paley, Pynchon, Dick, and Le Guin, are all born around the same generation, I think they all saw the Soviet Union as being a totalitarian government that had discredited the old left. That the old left, the Marxist way, had shown, and in this they weren't. They were sort of in agreement with what the CIA was saying in the 50s when they were promoting Jackson Pollock, and I think Ginsburg fits into this as well. They saw the Soviet Union as having discredited the Marxist, communist, statist path of the old left, that if you do that, you're just going to get a totalitarian state. And so the better thing to do, think all of these writers, and including the beat writers, so Ginsburg, as well as Paley and Pynchon and Le Guin, I think are all thinking we need to move toward a form of radicalism that has as its aspiration a free and equal society that will somehow be free and equal without the state. And to this, Le Guin adds a very, I think, West Coast, Pacific Northwest environmentalism that wasn't yet sort of fashionable. She was very interested in ecology and environment. So we have this pacifism, this environmentalism, this feminism, this anarchism that in many ways resembles also what Grace Paley, and in a slightly different way, what Pynchon was after as well. So that is Ursula K. Le Guin's life. And what I quoted from the Norton bio just talks about, they sort of summarize some of her fictions, and they say that the author believes that any reality is a cultural rather than strictly scientific description, and that one description is superior to another only in its functional persuasiveness. So what could be a more postmodern attitude? That really everything we encounter is a narrative, and we should distrust grand narratives like those of communism and Marxism that posit themselves as the one true way to the good society, and instead we should see everything as equally a culturally constructed narrative that can be altered and that is good for what it can do for us, but should be discarded if it's not working for us. So Le Guin is postmodern in that positive sense of Jean-Francois Lyotard, of the distrust of grand narratives and a consequent interest in plurality, diversity, anti-authoritarian ethics. So that is Le Guin, and I think you clearly see that in these two stories, both of which are not really straightforward science fiction stories. They're much more experimental stories. So the first story, oh right, I have a quote from Le Guin, by the way. I started doing that at the beginning of the semester, then I got away with it. So got away from it, so I thought I should go back. So I do have one quote from Le Guin I want to talk about before we look at the stories. It's from an essay. That's a clickable link if you go to the PDF of the slideshow, to just a collection of quotations from some of her essays on what she thought about art, storytelling, and the power of language. She says she believes, in accord with that postmodern idea that all of our cultures are just narrative constructs, is that if you change language, you will change the way we live. Because remember, Lyotard was influenced by the philosopher Wittgenstein, and Wittgenstein famously said, "The limits of my language are the limits of my world." And so it's very important then to change your language if you want to change your world. And this is sometimes, something the political left is accused of doing, of trying to socially engineer through linguistic engineering. And Le Guin says, yeah, sure, that's exactly what I'm trying to do. We can't restructure our society without restructuring the English language. One reflects the other. A lot of people, she says, are getting tired of that huge pool of metaphors that have to do with war and conflict and the proliferation of battle metaphors, such as being a warrior, fighting, defeating, and so on. In response, I could say that once you become conscious of these battle metaphors, you can start, quote, fighting against them. That's one option. Another is to realize that conflict is not the only human response to a situation, and to begin to find other metaphors, such as resisting, outwitting, skipping, or subverting. This kind of consciousness can open the door to all sorts of new behaviors. So she says, our culture is sort of saturated in these metaphors of war. We have a war on poverty. We have a war on drugs. She was fighting cancer. Everything is described as a fight, a conflict. And Ursula K. Le Guin says, because we use these metaphors, our society is therefore a very violent and warlike society. And if we could change our metaphors to something less martial, something less warlike, then you change the reality. And that's a very postmodern view. And fiction and literature become supremely important on this view, because who gives us our language and our metaphors and our stories but creative writers? And so the writer becomes this kind of social force who alters our consciousness by altering our language. It's a very ambitious view of society. And then why does she write science fiction? Well, because science fiction becomes a way to imagine other futures, imagine other languages, and imagine other worlds, and therefore change our own. Now, this was kind of latent in Philip K. Dick, but he wasn't nearly the theorist that Le Guin was. She's sort of theorizing it directly. You write science fiction to change our language, and you change our language to change the world. And just to give you a balanced perspective, what would, the old leftist, an old-fashioned Marxist would say, well, this is really nonsense. What determines language is actually economic reality. You have to change people's economic systems before you can change the way they think. An old Marxist, Karl Marx himself, would say that Ursula K. Le Guin has this completely backward. You change material reality before you change the way people think. She's going at it in the other direction. She wants to change the way people think before you can change material reality, which is basically what Grace Paley's father said to her in a conversation with my father, that you think the future is infinitely open to the imagination, and it's not. So this is the battle between the old left and the new left that we see coming out in the fiction of this period. And what do right wingers think? We'll find out next week. We're going to meet Joan Didion, who I would argue is a conservative, who will give you a properly conservative perspective on these issues. But for now, that's the battle, I think, between the old left and the new left. So that's where Le Guin is coming from as a writer. And I wanted to give you a quote from one of her essays, because not every fiction writer has a theory of what they're doing. Philip K. Dick, I don't think, had a theory of what he was doing. But she, like Flannery O'Connor, who we saw a couple weeks ago, she did. And so I wanted to give you that sense. So what are these two stories about? So we have Schrödinger's cat, which is named for a famous thought experiment in physics. And one of the things I think this shows is that a lot of times people who don't like postmodernism say that it's the airy theorizing of artists and humanists and people who study the humanities and who never make contact with reality like they do in the sciences. But really, that's not really fair, because if you look at particularly theoretical physics over the 20th century, you'll see that a lot of the themes of postmodernism in culture and art recur in the thinking of physicists. And so Schrödinger, who was a quantum theorist, and please don't expect me to explain physics to you in full, because I can't. I got a C in physics in high school. But at the theoretical level, I think I understand. Schrödinger did this thought experiment. He didn't do a real experiment, but he said that he was essentially trying to demonstrate this principle in quantum physics, which says that contrary to the old mechanical physics of Sir Isaac Newton, which held that there was an objective reality out there whose laws the scientist could just objectively discover and enumerate, that was the old Newtonian classical physics model. It's actually very similar to the Marxist model of social change. There's an objective reality out there, and the thinker just has to determine its laws. The quantum physicists, like we might say, the new left political thinkers, said, actually, that's not the way it works. The observer influences what is observed. And so you never get objective reality. You only get reality as filtered through the perception of the observer. And so Erwin, I'm not a physics person. Schrödinger, this physicist, he posited this thought experiment where you take, it seems sort of cruel, you take a cat, you put the cat in the box, and you release a chemical that may or may not kill the cat. And Schrödinger said, the cat is not alive or dead until you open the box, because reality does not exist until it is observed. And he was talking about certain quantum phenomena, whether or not light is a wave or a particle. It doesn't become one or the other until you do the experiment on it that determines it, and different experiments will yield different results. So reality depends on observation. What is observed depends on the observer. There is no grand narrative of objective truth to which anyone has access. So Schrödinger quantum physics is theorizing these ideas decades before postmodern philosophers. This is coming out of the hard sciences. And so Le Guin writes a story to reflect upon this thought experiment, and she takes it further. She says, well, if the universe is totally uncertain, then I can't write a coherent story. And if you read the story, it's completely absurd. It makes very little sense. She's meeting people whose heads are below their legs. You turn on the cold water and hot water comes out. She's saying if the universe is radically uncertain and doesn't exist until we observe it, then nothing from moment to moment is stable at all. The universe is radically and totally uncertain. And that's why the story is so surreal, is so totally a departure from realism. The first few pages don't make any sense at all. Then the end of the story starts to sort of gather itself into a parable. So she meets this person who's actually a dog named Rover. And there's a lot of wordplay throughout the story that I'll let you investigate on your own if you want. And Rover suggests that they conduct the Schrödinger's cat experiment. And he says that we cannot predict anything until it happens. So he says, if you desire any certainty, you must create it yourself. So the reason he wants to do the Schrödinger's cat experiment in real life, to take this cat that the narrator has taken on as a pet and put it in this box and either kill it or not and then open the box, is because that will create certainty. His view is very much like the existentialist view we started the semester with. There is no pre-given meaning, so we must create meaning. That was the existentialist perspective that we very much saw in Baldwin and O'Connor. The narrator, though, says that doesn't really make sense, because that won't create certainty and stability, because somebody could just be watching us. So yeah, we open the box and we find out if the cat's alive or dead, but we could be in a box that somebody else is watching and we wouldn't even know it. So our perspective can't secure stability. Because we don't know, there's really just an infinite number of perspectives making up the world, which means that the world has no certainty and has no stability and can have no certainty and can have no stability. So why don't we get included in the system when we lift the lid of the box? Why aren't we subject to the same quantum uncertainty? And that's basically what happens at the end of the story. They open the box and the cat isn't there, and then it begins to seem like the roof is lifting off the narrator's house, as if they have been just in this box. And in fact, they are in a box. They're in the box that is the story. Ursula K. Le Guin is doing a further thought experiment. She's put these characters in the box of her fiction, but what she's used the fiction to demonstrate is that we just need to learn to live with a totally uncertain universe. And that is the kind of true anarchist perspective. Instead of doing what Schrödinger wanted to do, which was to kill a cat to secure certainty, or what Marx wanted to do, which was to take over the state and liquidate the ruling class to create certainty. You can't create certainty. You just have to anarchically surf the uncertain cosmos. And that is the anarchic lesson of this story that rejects the idea that there is any way to fix reality. And so, like Pynchon's Entropy, which is a story that suggests that you just have to sort of live with entropy and correct it as you can, this story suggests much the same, but it's a much more radical literary performance, because it creates a kind of uncertainty where the story is constantly on the point of dissolving, but it never quite dissolves, and it becomes kind of a parable. So it's like Paley, like Pynchon, Le Guin is suggesting that we need to learn to live with and enjoy even, and learn to love even, a radically open and uncertain and potential world, which Dick, on the other hand, laments that we can't live in such a world. So I would say that Paley, Pynchon, and Le Guin give us the Lyotard version of postmodernism, beautiful pluralism, and Dick gives us the Jameson Baudrillard dystopian view of postmodernism as a world of total delusion and deracination. And just a final point on Le Guin's other brief parable, She Unnames Them. In this story, we see her feminist interests come out, and that's a great segue into next week's writing, which will be about the social movements of the 1960s, including women's liberation. And we had this feminist hint in Grace Paley's A Conversation with My Father, where it is the daughter who speaks back to the patriarch about the possibilities of an open future. And in this story, Le Guin takes it very far. She speaks back to the ultimate patriarch, who is God. And what happens is, in the Bible, in the book of Genesis, God creates Adam, and then he creates Eve out of Adam. And he gives, I think it's actually before he creates Eve, he gives Adam the responsibility of naming everything on earth. Adam names all the animals. And that's right at the heart of the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition of, that is the religious view of so much of the planet. You have this speciesism embodied, that it is human beings, and not just human beings, but males, who control nature and who dominate nature and who give names to nature. And in this story, Ursula K. Le Guin revises that. And she says, what if instead of after Adam names the animal, Eve unnames them, and Eve rejects this patriarchal authority? And why should they have names? Why should we impose? Why should we have this colonial relation to the rest of the natural world as human beings? So she unnames the animals. And what she finds is that the names were a barrier. The names had stood between myself and them like a clear barrier, so close that my fear of them and their fear of me became one same fear, and the attraction that many of us felt, the desire to smell one another's smells, feel or rub or caress one another's scales or skin or feathers or fur, taste one another's blood or flesh, keep one another warm, that attraction was now all one with the fear. So she becomes, to quote a later postmodern theorist, she becomes animal. She realizes that there is no distinction between human and animal once you remove this oppressive barrier of language. And so all life lives on one continuum that is determined by things like touch and smell and all the rest of the senses, rather than that visual hierarchy created by language. So written language is visual. So then she says, I'm going to give my name back to Adam. I want to be unnamed too. And so she gives her name back to Adam. He's not paying attention. What's he doing? He was fitting parts together, because that's what, so this is a very, how could I put it? It's a feminism that has very strong ideas about what men are like and what women are like. So he, like Schrödinger, like Marx, is trying to build some certain edifice. He's putting parts together. So he can't pay any attention to his wife or to animals. So he just says, whatever, what's for dinner? You know, this very patriarchal 1950s relation. And he doesn't even notice when she leaves, because he's so busy fitting parts together in this dubious quest for certainty. And she leaves, and she says, I'm going now with the... I hesitated because they don't have any names anymore. What with them, you know, and went on. And then the end of the story is really interesting, because you might have been thinking as you read the story, well, if language is such a barrier to this anarchic utopia that we and the animals could all be living in, why is Ursula K. Le Guin writing literature, which takes place, excuse me, nowhere else but in language? Well, she answers us at the end of the story. In fact, I had only just then realized how hard it would have been to explain myself. I could not chatter away as I used to do, taking it all for granted. My words now. So she had previously used language in a way that took everything for granted, that was just chatter. There was this dominative, name-giving, empty chatter. But she's not going to give up language. It's not that the human animal needs to become an animal that doesn't speak. My words now must be as slow, as new, as single, as tentative as the steps I took going down the path away from the house between the dark-branched, tall dancers, motionless against the winter shining. And you notice what she's done there. She stopped naming animals, and now she stopped naming anything. And what she provides in place of names are metaphors and metonymies. So metaphor, you remember, is when you compare two unlike things to suggest a likeness. So she calls, instead of saying trees, she says dancers. So she compares trees to dancers. And metonymy, you'll remember, is to describe something in terms of one part of it. And so instead of the sun, the morning, she says the shining, because the shining is the part of the sun, of the morning, of the sunrise, of the dawn. And so the legitimate use of language is not to impose a name on anything as if you owned it. The proper use of language is to concede that you are giving an imaginative perspective to something by using literary metaphors and metonymies. Literary language is the only appropriate language because it's provisional, it's contingent, it doesn't suggest it's the only way, and it doesn't impose, therefore. And so literature becomes the only proper, ethical, anarcha-feminist use of language. And that is how Le Guin changes language to change our perspective and therefore to change the world. And so that is Ursula K. Le Guin, and we will then next week look at a lot more of these political and social consequences of postmodernism as we look at the literature of the liberation movements of the 1960s. Thanks very much and have a great day.